The spring of 1944 found Europe at a pivotal crossroads. The war that had raged for half a decade was beginning to tilt against the Axis powers. In Germany, Adolf Hitler's authority over the military was absolute, yet cracks in his judgment were becoming increasingly visible. His obsession with scorched earth policies, the directive to destroy anything of strategic value when retreating, was creating tension between obedience and morality among his officers. One German general, stationed in France, would find himself at a historic crossroads that would forever etch his name in the annals of history. The story begins in the heart of occupied France, a land transformed by German occupation. Paris, the city of light, art, and culture, had been under Nazi control since June 1940. The Eiffel Tower, the Louvre, the bridges over the Seine, they all stood as silent witnesses to a 5-year occupation that had brought fear, repression, and terror. Yet amid this darkness, life continued. Parisians moved through their streets cautiously, whispers of resistance in cafes, and clandestine newspapers circulating under the nose of German authorities. It was a city under siege but not broken. Enter Dietrich von Choltitz, a general whose name would become synonymous with courage and moral clarity. Born in 1894 into a Prussian military family, von Choltitz had grown up steeped in the traditions of honor, discipline, and duty. He had seen the First World War firsthand, rising through the ranks with a sense of pragmatic responsibility. By the time the Second World War engulfed Europe, von Choltitz had become a seasoned officer, respected for his strategic mind and calm decisiveness under pressure. Yet nothing in his career could prepare him for the dilemma that awaited him in the spring of 1944. As the Allies advanced after the D-Day landings, Hitler grew increasingly paranoid and erratic. His strategy was not merely to defend territory, but to leave nothing of value to the enemy. Paris, with its bridges, monuments, and infrastructure, became a target of his fury. Hitler issued what would become known as the Nero Decree, a chilling order demanding the destruction of all infrastructure in Germany and occupied territories that could be of use to advancing Allied forces. Paris, he declared, must not fall intact into Allied hands. Bridges were to be blown, landmarks razed, and the cultural heart of France reduced to rubble. Von Choltitz received the order personally, along with a barrage of communications from Berlin emphasizing the dire consequences of disobedience. Hitler's words were stark. Obedience was non-negotiable, and failure meant not just disgrace but execution. The general, aware of his duty to follow orders, faced an impossible choice: execute Hitler's scorched earth plan and destroy a city revered worldwide, or defy a dictator whose vengeance spared no one. The stakes could not have been higher. From the moment he read the orders, von Choltitz began weighing his options. His mind was not clouded by blind loyalty. He had witnessed firsthand the devastation that Hitler's fanaticism could unleash. Cities like Warsaw and Rotterdam had already endured fire and ruin under German occupation. Yet Paris was different. Paris was a city whose cultural significance transcended military strategy. Its destruction would be remembered as a crime against civilization itself. In the early days of August 1944, von Choltitz started issuing subtle counter-orders. He delayed demolition preparations, avoided appointing officers to execute the plan, and began assessing the feasibility of defiance without immediate retribution. All the while, the city itself seemed suspended in anticipation, sensing that something critical was unfolding behind closed doors. Resistance leaders, ever watchful, began hearing rumors of a German general who might not carry out Hitler's orders. The tension in the city grew palpable. Allied forces were closing in from the west, and the liberation of Paris was imminent. Von Choltitz, however, remained in his office, facing a war of conscience. For him, obedience was a virtue, but morality was a higher calling. He understood the risk. Defying Hitler could mean death, but carrying out the decree could mean the irreversible destruction of one of the world's most iconic cities. This internal struggle between fear and duty became the defining moment of von Choltitz's career. Every day brought reports of Allied advances, the growth of the French resistance, and the increasing likelihood that the city would soon be liberated. Yet Hitler's orders hung over him like a shadow, demanding destruction, demanding obedience, demanding devastation. Von Choltitz had to act decisively, and the clock was ticking. In these critical days, he began to subtly sabotage the planned demolition. Explosives were stored but not armed. Sappers were instructed to delay preparations, citing logistical difficulties. Bridges were left intact, monuments left standing, and every act of inaction was a small rebellion. Von Choltitz's courage was quiet, meticulous, and calculated. He was not leading a grand uprising, but he was waging a moral war, one decision at a time. The broader context of the time only heightened the stakes. Hitler's paranoia extended beyond military defeat to the punishment of perceived traitors. Officers who failed to follow orders, even under impossible circumstances, faced summary execution or imprisonment. Von Choltitz's position was precarious. Any hint of insubordination could have meant instant death. Yet he remained resolute, guided by the principle that some actions were too catastrophic to justify obedience. As August progressed, the Allies drew ever closer to Paris. Skirmishes between German forces and the resistance intensified. Messages between von Choltitz and Berlin grew more urgent and insistent, demanding proof that the city would be destroyed. But von Choltitz, relying on both tactical acumen and sheer moral courage, continued to stall, buying precious time for the city and its inhabitants. By the eve of liberation, von Choltitz had made his decision. The city of Paris would not be destroyed. Every bridge, every monument, every cultural landmark would remain intact. In a world dominated by fear and tyranny, one general had chosen humanity over blind obedience, and the consequences of that choice would reverberate for generations. Part 1 ends here. Von Choltitz's quiet defiance had set the stage for the liberation of Paris, a story of moral courage and strategic genius that would soon unfold in the city's streets. The morning of August 19, 1944, dawned over Paris like any other, yet the air was thick with anticipation. Allied forces were closing in from the west, having broken out from Normandy weeks earlier. The French resistance, emboldened by the news of approaching liberators, was ready to rise against the German occupiers. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, aware that the days of occupation were numbered, yet fearful of the potential destruction that Hitler's orders could bring. Dietrich von Choltitz, the military governor of Paris, moved through his headquarters with deliberate calm. Behind the stoic facade of a German general was a man balancing the impossible, adherence to duty versus the imperative of humanity. Intelligence reports confirmed that the resistance was coordinating uprisings across key districts, attempting to take control before the Allies arrived. The German garrison in Paris numbered around 20,000, a force capable of putting up resistance. Yet von Choltitz's mind was already focused on mitigation, not aggression. Throughout the day, skirmishes erupted in the streets. The resistance had begun to assert control over key positions. Barricades were erected, German patrols ambushed, and the population rallied in quiet yet determined rebellion. Reports filtered into von Choltitz's office detailing the chaos. The city was in the throes of a controlled insurrection, and every report reminded him of the fragile window. He had to preserve Paris. Every bridge that remained unblown, every monument still standing, was a victory against Hitler's destructive vision. In the corridors of power, von Choltitz faced relentless pressure. Berlin demanded updates, reiterating the necessity of obeying the Nero decree. Yet communications with the Führer were increasingly perfunctory. Hitler's insistence grew urgent, yet von Choltitz's replies were measured, precise and intentionally delaying. Each response was a careful act of rebellion, calibrated to prevent immediate suspicion. On August 20th, the first significant clashes erupted near the Hôtel de Ville. The city hall that symbolized Parisian governance and resistance alike. Resistance fighters engaged German troops, creating a flurry of chaos in the streets. Von Choltitz, observing from his headquarters, made a decisive move. He ordered his troops to adopt a defensive posture, minimal aggression, aimed at containment rather than annihilation. His instructions were clear: avoid destruction, avoid civilian casualties, and above all, prevent the implementation of Hitler's scorched earth orders. At the same time, von Choltitz began secret negotiations with representatives of the resistance. These initial contacts were cautious, shrouded in suspicion and mistrust. The resistance had heard rumors of a German general who might spare the city, yet they remained skeptical. Von Choltitz understood that trust had to be earned, and he offered discreet assurances. Paris would not be destroyed, and German forces would not engage in wholesale slaughter or demolition. Every word was measured, designed to signal intent without fully exposing his position to Berlin. The city's streets became a theater of tension. On one side, German troops cautiously maintained control of key positions. On the other, resistance fighters sought to assert their liberation. Civilians moved through the streets with equal parts fear and hope, aware that each day could bring liberation or catastrophe. Von Choltitz's orders were quietly subverting. Hitler's command, explosives intended for bridges and landmarks, remained untouched. Artillery was held in reserve, and destruction plans were delayed indefinitely. Meanwhile, von Choltitz's internal struggle continued. Loyalty to the military chain of command was ingrained in him, yet the immensity of what he was about to prevent gave him moral clarity. He had spent decades as a soldier, but this moment required the courage to defy orders for a higher purpose. The city, a jewel of European culture, rested in his hands. One wrong move could bring about untold devastation. Yet his resolve was unwavering. On August 23rd, Allied forces under General Philippe Leclerc entered French territory just west of Paris. Their advance signaled the inevitability of liberation. Von Choltitz now faced the final test of his defiance. The full weight of Hitler's expectations pressed upon him, yet the city itself called for preservation. The resistance, emboldened by the news, intensified their operations, taking control of administrative buildings, cutting off German supply lines, and preparing for the symbolic act of liberating the city hall. By August 24th, the city was in open revolt. French fighters stormed key positions, barricades stood at major intersections, and civilians cheered in cautious jubilation. Von Choltitz, observing the turmoil, realized that the moment of truth had arrived. The German forces, under his command, could either execute the Nero decree or allow the city to survive. His decision would define not only his career, but the fate of Paris itself. That evening, he convened a council of senior officers. The discussion was tense, each officer torn between loyalty to Hitler and the reality unfolding in the streets. Von Choltitz spoke with calm authority, emphasizing discipline but also highlighting the futility and moral cost of destroying the city. His arguments were clear. The Allies would enter. The city's destruction would serve no strategic purpose, and obedience to Hitler's irrational orders would result in unnecessary loss of life and irreparable cultural devastation. This was not a decision taken lightly. Von Choltitz's defiance carried enormous risk. Should Hitler learn of his inaction, execution was certain. Yet von Choltitz's moral calculus was clear. He had seen the consequences of blind obedience in other occupied territories. He knew that history would judge him not for following orders, but for what he chose to preserve. As night fell on August 24th, Paris was on the brink. The resistance controlled significant portions of the city. Allied forces were approaching, and von Choltitz had made his final preparations to defy Hitler. Bridges remained intact, monuments untouched, and the population sensed the possibility of salvation. The city was alive with anticipation, yet the shadow of war still loomed. In those critical hours, von Choltitz demonstrated remarkable foresight. He coordinated the surrender of German forces to the resistance, minimizing bloodshed and ensuring an orderly transition. He personally oversaw the disarmament of German troops, preventing rogue elements from executing destructive plans. Every decision was calculated, precise, and ultimately heroic. By the early hours of August 25, 1944, the culmination of von Choltitz's defiance was clear. Paris had survived. Bridges spanning the Seine remained unblown. Landmarks like the Eiffel Tower and Notre Dame stood intact, and the city's streets, though scarred by battle, remained vibrant with life. Von Choltitz had achieved the impossible. He had disobeyed Hitler without paying the ultimate price, and he had preserved the soul of Paris. August 25, 1944, would forever be remembered as the day Paris was liberated, and Dietrich von Choltitz, the German general who defied Hitler, became an unlikely hero of history. The streets of Paris were alive with a mixture of jubilation, relief, and disbelief. The people who had endured 4 years of occupation now saw their city intact, its bridges spanning the Seine, its monuments standing proudly, and its cultural treasures preserved. Yet behind the scenes, the military and political maneuvering that had ensured this outcome was a tale of immense courage, calculation, and moral resolve. Von Choltitz's first move that morning was to formally contact the leaders of the French resistance. Using secure, discreet channels, he arranged for a meeting at the Hotel Meurice, a neutral and symbolic location where both sides could negotiate without triggering unnecessary bloodshed. The meeting was fraught with tension. On one side, a German general whose loyalty to Hitler had been unquestionable for decades. On the other, resistance leaders, who had suffered immeasurable hardships and had every reason to distrust him. Yet von Choltitz approached the encounter with a combination of pragmatism and humanity. He made clear that German forces would surrender the city in an orderly manner, that civilians would not be harmed, and that Paris's infrastructure and cultural landmarks would remain untouched. For the resistance, this was astonishing news. Years of fear, oppression, and rumors of destruction had conditioned them to expect brutality. But here was a German general, defying Hitler, choosing preservation over destruction. As negotiations continued, von Choltitz coordinated the surrender of key German positions throughout Paris. Barricades manned by German troops were ordered to lower their arms. Checkpoints were systematically dismantled, and strategic locations were handed over to resistance fighters. This meticulous planning prevented chaos and avoided the kind of indiscriminate violence that often accompanies urban combat. Every order von Choltitz gave reinforced his commitment. Paris would survive, intact and free. Meanwhile, Allied forces were advancing rapidly from the west. General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division, one of the key French units under Free French command, approached the outskirts of the city. Communications between von Choltitz and Allied commanders were delicate. He needed to coordinate the surrender without revealing the full extent of his defiance too early, in case Berlin intercepted the messages. The stakes could not have been higher. One misstep, and the city's destruction could still occur. By mid-morning, Leclerc's forces entered Paris. The sight that greeted them was remarkable. Resistance fighters holding positions, German troops lowering their weapons, and civilians cheering in the streets. Von Choltitz himself oversaw the process, personally ensuring that no hidden explosives had been planted in bridges, tunnels, or monuments. The Eiffel Tower remained unscathed. Notre Dame stood proudly above the Seine, and the Louvre, symbol of art and culture, had not been touched. Throughout the day, von Choltitz met with Allied officers to finalize the surrender. His demeanor was calm, professional, and composed, traits that had defined his career, but now carried a moral weight far beyond military protocol. He explained the layout of German positions, the locations of armaments, and the details necessary to prevent accidental destruction. Allied commanders were stunned by the precision and foresight of his planning. Here was a man who, by the letter of military law, could have been considered an enemy, but by the measure of history, he had become a guardian of civilization. The surrender was completed with remarkable efficiency. German troops, numbering around 20,000, were disarmed and confined to designated areas, while the city transitioned smoothly under the control of the resistance and Allied forces. Civilians poured into the streets, waving flags, singing songs of liberation, and reclaiming the public spaces that had been under occupation for years. Paris was alive once more, and the survival of its infrastructure was a testament to von Choltitz's courage and moral clarity. In the aftermath, von Choltitz faced an uncertain future. By defying Hitler, he risked retribution from the remnants of the Nazi hierarchy. Yet, with Paris liberated and German forces surrendering, the immediate danger passed. Allied authorities were faced with the paradox of treating him both as a former enemy and as a man who had performed a historic act of preservation. Von Choltitz was eventually taken into custody by the Allies, where he recounted his actions and explained his reasoning. His calm, methodical account emphasized that his decisions had been driven, not by rebellion alone, but by a deep sense of duty to humanity and culture. The liberation of Paris, facilitated by von Choltitz's defiance, became a symbolic turning point in World War II. Unlike other cities that had been ravaged by retreating German forces, Warsaw and Rotterdam among them, Paris remained a beacon of European civilization. Its bridges, monuments, and historic buildings survived, allowing the city to reclaim its role as a center of art, culture, and diplomacy in the post-war world. Von Choltitz's decision demonstrated that even within the rigid, brutal hierarchy of Nazi Germany, individual moral courage could prevail. Historians have long debated the implications of von Choltitz's actions. Some view him as a pragmatist who calculated that preservation of Paris served German interests in maintaining order. Others see a man guided by conscience, willing to risk his career and life to prevent cultural annihilation. Regardless of interpretation, the outcome is undeniable. Paris, the city of light, remained unbroken. Von Choltitz's choice would echo through history, celebrated as an extraordinary act of ethical defiance amidst the horrors of war. By the end of August 25th, the city was firmly in Allied and French hands. Von Choltitz had not only preserved Paris physically, but had also protected the spirit of the city and its people. Streets that might have been reduced to rubble became avenues of freedom. Landmarks that might have been obliterated became symbols of resilience. The moral and historical significance of his actions was profound. One man's courage had altered the course of history, ensuring that Paris's legacy would endure. The liberation of Paris left an indelible mark on history, not merely for the strategic victory it represented, but for the moral courage displayed by one man amidst the chaos of war. Dietrich von Choltitz, the German general who defied Hitler's orders to destroy the city, became a figure whose legacy would spark debate, admiration, and reflection for decades to come. His actions challenged the conventional understanding of duty, obedience, and morality within a military hierarchy that often demanded blind loyalty, even at the cost of human life and culture. In the days following Paris's liberation, von Choltitz was taken into Allied custody, Initially, he was viewed with the same suspicion and caution reserved for enemy officers. His rank, his years of service, and his role as military governor naturally associated him with the machinery of the Nazi war effort. Yet, as he recounted the events of August 1944, it became clear that his defiance had been deliberate, calculated, and motivated by a profound ethical awareness. He described in meticulous detail how he had stalled demolition plans, delayed orders, and negotiated with the resistance to preserve the city. His account painted a picture of a man willing to risk everything to save not only infrastructure and monuments but the very soul of a city. Von Choltitz's reflections on his decision reveal a complex moral landscape. He had spent decades in the German military, imbibing its values of discipline, loyalty, and obedience. Yet the Nero decree represented a line he could not cross. To obey would have meant participating in what he recognized as a moral catastrophe, the deliberate annihilation of an entire city, its cultural heritage, and the lives of countless civilians. His courage lay not in defiance for its own sake, but in the moral clarity to recognize the difference between lawful orders and ethically catastrophic commands. Historians have debated whether von Choltitz's decision was motivated purely by conscience or also influenced by pragmatism. Some argue that he understood the futility of destroying Paris when Allied victory was inevitable, and that sparing the city preserved his reputation and avoided unnecessary destruction for Germany's future. Others emphasize the humanistic dimension, that von Choltitz recognized the unparalleled cultural and symbolic significance of Paris, and he refused to let it be obliterated. Likely, both perspectives hold truth. His actions were informed by both a rational assessment of the military situation and a deeply felt ethical responsibility, a rare combination in a world dominated by authoritarianism and fear. For the people of Paris, von Choltitz became an unlikely hero. Stories of his decision spread quickly throughout the liberated city. Citizens who had feared the destruction of their homes, landmarks, and heritage were able to walk freely along streets that might have been reduced to rubble. The Eiffel Tower, Notre Dame, the Seine's bridges, and the Louvre all remained intact. The preservation of these icons allowed Parisians to reclaim not only their city physically but their sense of identity and cultural continuity. In a war defined by devastation, this was an extraordinary gift. Von Choltitz's legacy also held lessons for the German military and the broader understanding of individual responsibility in wartime. The notion that obedience to authority can justify morally indefensible actions had long been a central tenet of military doctrine, especially under totalitarian regimes. By choosing defiance over blind compliance, von Choltitz challenged this assumption and demonstrated that moral courage could coexist with military professionalism. His example would later inform debates about ethical responsibility, accountability, and the capacity for conscience even within rigid hierarchies. In the post-war years, von Choltitz's story became more widely known through memoirs, interviews, and historical studies. He recounted with humility how he viewed his actions not as heroism but as necessary preservation. Yet, the historical record has recognized the extraordinary nature of his choice. Paris's survival stood as a testament to the idea that individuals, even in the most extreme circumstances, can exercise agency and uphold humanistic values, even against tyrannical authority. The symbolism of Paris's preservation cannot be overstated. Cities across Europe had been reduced to rubble under retreatings, German forces, or Allied bombings. Warsaw, Rotterdam, and other urban centers bore the scars of total destruction. Paris, by contrast, emerged intact, a beacon of resilience, culture, and history. Von Choltitz's role in this outcome has been described by some historians as the most important act of civil courage. In the Second World War, he had prevented not only physical destruction but the psychological and cultural devastation that would have accompanied it. Moreover, von Choltitz's story has served as a moral touchstone in discussions about the responsibilities of military officers and the limits of obedience. In military academies and historical studies, his decisions are often cited as an example of ethical leadership in the face of authoritarian demands. The delicate balance he maintained, protecting the city while fulfilling certain obligations as a commanding officer, demonstrates that principled defiance is not necessarily an abandonment of duty, but a redefinition of it in accordance with higher moral imperatives. In France, the narrative of von Choltitz has been particularly compelling. He is remembered as the man who saved Paris, a rare figure in history whose actions transcended the context of war to preserve a city's heritage and spirit. Monuments, museums, and landmarks that survived owe their continued existence to his courage. Artists, writers, and historians have repeatedly highlighted the significance of his decision, emphasizing how one man's moral clarity can alter the course of history. By the late 20th century, von Choltitz had embraced his role as a witness to history. In interviews, documentaries, and memoirs, he consistently framed his decision as a moral imperative, stressing that the preservation of Paris was the only reasonable course of action in the face of orders that would have resulted in catastrophe. He reflected on the paradoxes of war, how loyalty to orders can conflict with loyalty to humanity, and how courage sometimes requires challenging authority rather than blindly following it. In a broader sense, von Choltitz's actions highlight the enduring tension between obedience and conscience, a theme that resonates far beyond the specific context of Paris in 1944. His story demonstrates that even in a totalitarian regime, where fear and repression are constant, individual agency matters. One person, guided by ethical judgment and moral courage, can prevent tragedy on a scale that seems unimaginable. In this light, von Choltitz's legacy is not only historical, but profoundly humanistic, serving as a reminder that moral clarity can triumph over tyranny. The liberation of Paris in August 1944 was not only a military milestone, it was a triumph of moral courage, strategic foresight, and the power of conscience in a world dominated by fear and authoritarianism. Dietrich von Choltitz, the German general who defied Hitler's orders to destroy the city, had ensured that one of the greatest cultural and historical centers of Europe survived the horrors of war. His actions resonated far beyond the streets of Paris, offering enduring lessons about ethics, leadership, and the human capacity for moral judgment. In the weeks following the liberation, Paris slowly began to rebuild, not just physically but emotionally. Civilians returned to their homes and workplaces, schools reopened, and public life resumed amid the echoes of celebration and relief. The streets were alive with color, music, and laughter once again. Paris had escaped the fate that had befallen other cities like Warsaw or Rotterdam, where cultural destruction and civilian suffering had been immense. And at the heart of this, survival was one man's choice, a decision that balanced pragmatism with principle, fear with courage. Von Choltitz, now under Allied custody, faced a unique position. While many German officers were treated strictly as adversaries, he was recognized as someone who had acted to preserve human life and cultural heritage. Interviews and testimony allowed him to explain the reasoning behind his defiance. He described the meticulous care with which he had prevented demolitions, the calculated delays he had issued, and the careful coordination with the French resistance and Allied forces. In doing so, he made it clear that his actions were deliberate and courageous, not the result of accident or convenience. His reflections on the responsibility of command offer lessons that transcend the specific events of Paris. Von Choltitz understood that obedience to orders, even in the most rigid military hierarchy, was not an absolute moral imperative. True leadership, he believed, requires discernment, an understanding of when compliance becomes complicity in immoral actions. By choosing to save Paris, he demonstrated that moral courage is compatible with professional duty and that ethical considerations must sometimes override strict obedience, especially in situations of extreme consequence. Historians have noted that von Choltitz's decision to spare Paris was unprecedented. The scale of potential destruction was immense. Bridges over the Seine could have been blown, landmarks reduced to rubble, and thousands of civilians killed. The Nero decree was clear in its demands for destruction, yet von Choltitz's careful defiance ensured that the city's historical, cultural, and civic treasures survived. This act of preservation stands as one of the most significant examples of ethical decision-making in wartime history. For the people of Paris, von Choltitz became a symbol of unexpected hope. Stories circulated of how the German general had deliberately delayed demolition, negotiated with the resistance, and personally ensured that key buildings remained untouched. While he was never fully lionized in the immediate post-war period, given his position as a German officer, his legacy grew over time as historians, writers, and filmmakers documented the events. He came to be remembered not as a military adversary, but as a guardian of civilization in one of its darkest moments. The preservation of Paris had profound cultural and historical significance. Artworks that might have been destroyed remained accessible to future generations. Monuments that embodied centuries of history continued to inspire, and the city's bridges and public spaces survived to serve as functional and symbolic connectors. By sparing Paris, von Choltitz ensured that the city could continue its role as a global center of culture, diplomacy, and intellectual life. In a sense, he saved not just buildings, but the very soul of a city. The broader implications of von Choltitz's actions also reverberate in discussions about ethics, leadership, and responsibility in both military and civilian contexts. His story challenges the notion that individuals are powerless under authoritarian systems, showing instead that calculated, courageous defiance can have monumental consequences. It also serves as a reminder that moral clarity and ethical courage are not just philosophical ideals. They can and should guide decision-making, even when stakes are high and consequences uncertain. In later years, von Choltitz reflected on the paradoxes of his experience. He spoke of the tension between duty and conscience, obedience and morality, fear and courage. He emphasized that his choice to save Paris was not an act of heroism in the traditional sense, but a necessary moral response to prevent destruction that could never be justified. He often remarked on the heavy responsibility of command, acknowledging that every officer in his position must grapple with the ethical consequences of their actions, especially in times of war. Today, Paris stands as a living testament to what von Choltitz preserved. The Eiffel Tower continues to soar above the city. Notre Dame, despite modern-day challenges, remains a symbol of resilience. The bridges spanning the Seine continue to connect the city's neighborhoods, and the Louvre houses countless treasures, all spared from wartime obliteration. Each landmark, each street, and each plaza is a reminder that, even amidst the devastation of war, moral courage can prevail. The story of Dietrich von Choltitz also offers timeless lessons for humanity. It reminds us that individuals matter, that one person's ethical decisions can influence the course of history. It underscores the principle that true leadership involves more than following orders. It requires the wisdom to discern right from wrong, even under immense pressure. And it illuminates the enduring truth that the preservation of culture, life, and civilization sometimes depends on the quiet courage of a single human being. In the end, the German general who defied Hitler did more than save buildings. He preserved hope, dignity, and a sense of human decency at a time when the world was overwhelmed by cruelty and destruction. Paris, the city of light, survived because one man chose to uphold conscience over command. Dietrich von Choltitz's legacy remains a beacon, showing that even in the darkest hours of history, moral courage can shine through, and that the actions of a single individual can alter the fate of a city, a nation, and ultimately the world. If you enjoyed this documentary, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more incredible World War II stories. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps support the channel.